I'm very impressed with the number of people that have showed up for this event, and I'm also very impressed with the enthusiasm that many of the issues that face Israel, particularly along the coast, have so much support. I'm going to change the geography slightly because I'm not going to talk so much about the land and the beaches. I'm going to talk about the area of Israel that lies beyond the beaches, and that's the sea. And I'm going to particularly be talking about marine spatial planning, which I'm sure is a term that is not terribly meaningful to many of you. I'll try to explain it relatively simply. And I'm going to be talking primarily from an international perspective. So I'm going to say something about the condition of the sea globally, make the point that all of this is very much connected globally, and certainly in the Mediterranean, and certainly Israel has interests and responsibilities that go beyond just the what's known as the exclusive economic zone, and I'll explain all of these terms as we go along. If I can find, where do I go here? Okay, sorry, found it. I wanted to explain why it's important to think about planning the sea. We've heard a lot about the difficulties of planning along the coast, implementation along the coast, implementation without planning, sometimes planning without implementation. So it's important to understand how this all fits together. This is the perception that many people have of the sea. It's an empty space. So why do we need planning? Another perception that many people have is everything is fine offshore. We may have problems on the beach, but everything offshore is okay. So why do we need planning? And this is reality. We're in an evolutionary period where we've gone from very few uses of the sea, primarily fishing, defense, a few other activities, not much going on out there, to a period of industrialization of the sea, starting with oil and gas and a few other activities, industrial fishing. But as we move along and move ahead and think 20 years into the future, we certainly are going to need marine spatial planning. The problem is that the ocean, the sea, is an increasingly busy place. And the best time to plan is before too much gets built in the sea. Before major infrastructure investments are made, it's very difficult to move oil platforms, gas platforms, offshore wind turbines. It's hard to move them around after you have them constructed. So we need to start planning now. And the whole idea of marine spatial planning, MSP, is less of a choice, should we do it or not, than a real necessity as the sea gets busier. So why spatial planning? Well, we're doing increasingly more activities. We're depending more and more on the resources of the sea, not only as a source of food, but for marine transportation, for military operations, for living resources and the protection of habitat for those resources, for energy, minerals, recreation, research, and increasingly an interest in protecting species and their habitats. As the oceans get busier and busier, conflicts among these uses are inevitable. They happen on land. As we get closer and closer together, we have conflicts among uses on land. We have conflicts in space and time already in the ocean. Conflicts between human uses, between marine transportation and oil and gas, or wind turbines and recreational activities. Lots of conflicts already occurring in places. If you think of the North Sea, which I would say is an industrialized sea, this is going to be the future of many places offshore unless we do some serious planning and take care of the resources that we think are important. Take, for example, fisheries. The world's fish that are out there are in grave danger, and they're in grave danger from us because we not only depend on them, we've gotten very efficient at collecting fish for food. It wasn't always like that. Back in 1950, only 7% of global fisheries were actually used. 77% were unused, basically. Very different situation today. It's gotten much worse. There's no stock in the ocean. There's no one fish or fisheries stock in the ocean that is not in trouble. There's no undeveloped stocks. We've basically fished all of them. 60% have collapsed, again, globally. I think the Mediterranean is not much better than that. And in fact, a very vital global resource for food is very much in danger. Coral reefs as habitats that fish and other marine animals live in. We've lost 30% of our corals globally. And again, the Mediterranean and Israel are probably not much different in terms of these kinds of numbers. Seagrass habitats. Again, nobody thinks about seagrasses very much. These are very important critical habitats for many living resources. And again, the number seems to be fairly consistent across habitats. About 30% of the world's seagrasses have already been lost from primarily coastal development. Turtles depend very much on seagrasses. Okay? When you lose seagrasses, you're going to lose turtles. And the turtles are in a fairly sorry state. The 3 species in the Mediterranean are all threatened or endangered species. The top predators, the animals like sharks that we have a certain image of, are very important to the food chain, the food web, and they're also very important with respect to the integrity of the entire ecosystem. We need these big animals out there to take care of foraging other animals that depend on good ecosystem health. And almost 90% of these large predators, sharks, tunas, swordfish, billfish, have been lost. And all of this is, of course, conditioned on the fact that world population, coastal population in general, population around Israel and within Israel, is increasing. So where we've gone from 3 billion people in 1960, we're looking at 9 billion people in another 20 or 30 years. And on top of all of that, there's climate change. We have things like rising heat content of the sea. It's causing problems with respect to many of the animals that are there. Shifts in whole species moving from one place to another because they prefer a certain temperature. Sea level changes in terms of impacts on coastal areas. All of these setbacks that we have may be quite irrelevant if we have a 1 meter increase in sea level over the next 50 years. Sea surface temperature, again, temperature is very, very important. The animal that I showed, basically all turtles are very dependent on temperature. And temperature affects the sex ratio of turtles. And the higher the temperature, the more females that are born. And in fact, we may face a situation where we have many more females than we have males. When we have these kinds of problems, one of the solutions, and I want to talk about solutions because I just don't want to give you a list of problems. When we talk about solutions, many groups, particularly non-governmental environmental groups, say, well, the answer is simple. We need more marine protected areas. And that's true. We do need more marine protected areas. And in fact, that's been recognized on a global basis. We have global targets that say that by 2020, about 10% of every country, the marine area of every country, should be a marine protected area. That's good, and we should have that. Many countries are exceeding that already. Many are not. But the problem is that we still only have about 2 or 3% of the ocean that is actually in some protected kind of status. And in fact, if we look at within that 3%, if we look at how many marine protected areas are really protected, it's closer to 1% in terms of protected in terms of extracting resources from the area. So marine protected areas may be a solution, but we're a long way away from having large impacts on the marine environment. MPAs, marine protected areas, can't do it all, and that's where marine spatial planning comes in. The caveat is that marine spatial planning is not just a marine conservation program. It is not just establishing marine protected areas. It's trying to figure out how we are going to balance social, economic, and ecological objectives in a particular place, whether it's Israel or Vietnam or British Columbia in Canada. And it's important to realize that this is a public process, because as the mayor said in the first his presentation, the ocean is a public space. It's a public resource. The people who are responsible for managing that resource under most legislation is the government, typically the national government. But in fact, we're all responsible for it, non-governmental organizations, the private sector, the public, and governments at all levels, national and local, are responsible for taking care of this resource. And we can do it through a process like marine spatial planning, because it is a public process, it is transparent, and the kinds of documents, like the Marine Plan for Israel that has just been released, is a mechanism through which we can make these kinds of things happen. These are the characteristics of marine spatial planning as it could be carried out. And these are all from a document that UNESCO has produced in terms of actually how do we take care of marine spatial planning? How do we get there from thinking about organizing all the way through implementing marine spatial plans? But one of the most important things is that marine spatial planning should be focused on places, whether the place is the entire exclusive economic zone of Israel, the entire Mediterranean, the entire northwestern Atlantic. All of these places are places that should have some relationship to people, so that people value the areas, they value, more importantly, the resources that are present in those areas. Marine spatial planning should also be participatory. It should be transparent, it should involve many different interests, all of the interests that have any kind of stake, any interest in the region. It should be multi-objective and integrated. That means we're not just doing fisheries management, or not just doing renewable resource or renewable energy management. We want to be focusing on the interrelationships of how to get all of these kinds of things where they are reasonable and environmentally sustainable. All of these different interests represented in a marine spatial plan. It should be future-oriented. That's the definition of what planning is about. We can't do very much about where we are today, but we can certainly change the future. And plans should be made to change the future. We want to get to some state that we all agree is where we want to be in 20 years, in 50 years, however long the planning horizon is. But we want to be able to have that kind of future orientation. Ecosystem-based is something that we incorporate in marine spatial planning. We want to know what areas are most biologically or ecologically important, so that as we make decisions about where to place certain kinds of activities, we're aware of what we should be protecting. Or if we choose not to protect that one place, we should realize what we are losing, probably forever, with respect to marine resources. And then finally, marine spatial planning should be continuing and adaptive. That means the way we have done planning historically, where we have a master plan that is supposed to be the way we're going to operate for the next 50 years, doesn't make a lot of sense in an environment like the sea, where we have a great deal of uncertainty, where technology and economics and politics and lots of different things are changing almost continuously. So we want to have a plan that is capable of being updated on a fairly regular basis and adapted to ensure that we are doing things that work and we stop doing things that are not working. I'm going to say a little bit about the state of where we are with respect to the entire globe and where Israel fits into that. And the focus is what I call marine waters under national jurisdiction. So we're talking about from the shore out to 200 nautical miles. That includes something that we call the territorial sea and the exclusive economic zone. And this is what that looks like with respect to a simple diagram. The national jurisdiction includes the territorial sea, that is typically in most countries, not all, but most countries out to 12 nautical miles. Sometimes under the jurisdiction of subnational institutions, but often also part of the national authority, all the way out to 200 nautical miles. And obviously in places like the Mediterranean, we're talking about areas that have to be smaller than that because of the shared jurisdictions across national boundaries. So it's not always 200 nautical miles, but that's the idea that I'm talking about today. It's a substantial part of the Earth. The land is only about 29% of the Earth. The rest is water. The rest is basically salt water. It's either areas that are under exclusive economic zones and territorial seas, that's about the same amount as the land, or areas that are in something called the high seas, and those are areas that are beyond national jurisdiction. Generally, again, areas beyond 200 nautical miles. A substantial part of the ocean, over 40%. This is what we're talking about today. If you only take the water part, the saltwater part, it's about 40% exclusive economic zones and 60% high seas. And this is what the global picture looks like. The red arrow is Israel, a relatively small national territory. Many of the other areas, like Australia, Norway, to a certain extent Canada, large national jurisdictions have already begun marine spatial planning. In fact, the dark blue areas are those areas that already have government-approved national plans. The blue arrows are areas that have recently started marine spatial planning but have not gotten to the approval process. This is where we are. 10 years ago, there were 3 countries that were actually focusing and developing marine spatial plans. Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, has long been the pioneer in terms of actually doing not only a plan, but a zoning map that shows where uses are allowed with respect to that very large marine protected area, 345,000 square kilometers. I think that's 10 times the size of Israel, is how big the Great Barrier Reef is. In 2006, there were a couple of other countries, particularly those small areas in the North Sea, areas that are more like Israel with respect to the size of the area. But Belgium and the Netherlands, small EEZs, intensely used EEZs, were actually doing marine spatial planning. And those are, in fact, the original ones that the government actually approved. 5 years later, we have 7 approved plans. In 2015, we'll have 13 approved plans. In 2020, there will be 44 countries that have approved plans, and Israel is somewhere in the middle of those two columns. But by 2050 or 2025, we'll have over 50 marine plans globally. Now, I'll show you what that represents in terms of the area of the ocean. This is the list of countries, again, where marine spatial planning activities are taking place. And again, you can see that Israel is not the only one, but Israel is far ahead of many parts of the world, a real pioneer in terms of thinking about marine spatial planning. This is the percent of area that's covered. Now remember, I said that marine protected areas cover about 2 to 3% of the ocean. In 2015, we've got about 7% of the world's oceans covered by marine protected areas, government-approved protected areas. 2020, we'll have 15%. 2025, shooting for something between 40 and 50% of the world's oceans under a marine plan. And again, marine protected areas are very much an integral part of that whole process. But this is the bigger picture, countries that actually have looked at all uses with respect to where those uses should take place in their sea areas. The big jump is because of the European Union. The European Union has legislation now that requires all European Union countries, member states as they're called, member states to have a marine spatial plan by the year 2021. So this big leap forward in terms of numbers is going to be due primarily to all of the EU countries participating in marine spatial plans, including the Northern Mediterranean EU countries. Now, just a few comments about where the Israeli plan fits in. Again, I think this document is important because you've actually got a plan now. And it was only because of the initiative of Technion and Shermay and colleagues that have actually done a plan. This is a major accomplishment to sort of show how a plan can be constructed. Okay? Many countries talk about doing planning. not many move forward with the Marine Spatial Plan. So you have something that at least is a prototype in terms of how it might be improved over time. Taken as a model, what do we do the next round of planning? And obviously we could have used a lot more information that wasn't available to the people that did the Marine Spatial Plan, the initial Marine Spatial Plan. But if you remember, I said it's a continuing process. We've learned how to do planning now, at least in marine planning in Israel, in terms of what was done by Technion. And that's, again, a leap forward. I think there are some things that obviously could be improved. Remember, a plan is a plan. It is not the final results that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve sustainable development. We're trying to achieve environmental or ecological protection, economic development, employment, a lot of different things in terms of planning. And that requires probably a little bit more detail than we have in this first round of planning. Okay? But that's relatively easy to do once you have an idea of where you want to go with respect to what this document might look like. And I know the government has, in the process of just completing some of its initial efforts to put together a better information base with which to do planning. That's good. But again, it's easy to collect data. That's probably the easiest thing we can do in terms of planners. Planners like to collect data because sometimes it avoids work, real work in terms of trying to produce a plan. So we have to go somewhere between having a lot of information, a lot of data, and having a plan. There's a big gap between those two things that requires a lot of analysis and a lot of thinking about the future and actually coming up with ideas that are not only just general goals, and there are goals specified in the Israeli plan now, going beyond goals and even to a certain extent going beyond the next level of detail, which are called policy measures in the plan that Shimei will talk a great deal more about this afternoon, to real actions that will actually implement some of these ideas through an implementation plan. So there are more things to be done than we'll hear about today, but a tremendous start. I'd like to finish my talks in general by citing a famous marine spatial planner, Confucius. And he's talking about implementation here. I mean, you know, all of planning is not any good unless we actually produce results. And when he says talk doesn't boil rice, it simply means that we can't just stop with talking or actually just writing. We have to go through implementation to have a results-based kind of outcomes that we want from a planning process. This is another famous marine spatial planner, Mae West. You may recognize her. She was quite a film star and quite a character. And this is one of her quotes that I like to use as well because it applies very much to marine spatial planning. And you can quote me on this one. I said that I never said it would be easy, but I only said it would be worth it in the end. So, thank you very much.